Hello and welcome back to our study in the book of 1 Samuel. We're about halfway through. We are halfway through. We have 4 more studies to go, and I'm so glad you're with us. I hope you've been enjoying the study and studying along with us, and hopefully this study will be beneficial and interesting and edifying, and we'll have some great lessons from our study together. The title of this study is, I Felt Compelled. And we're going to see these were the words of Saul. And really this was a rationale for his rebellion against God's commandments. Let me ask you a question before we get into this study. What is the worst sin that can be committed? What is the worst sin in the eyes of God that anyone can commit? Now some might say murder, others might say lying, adultery, homosexuality. But listen, I want to suggest that the worst sin in the eyes of God is rebellion. Rebelling against a positive command. Just saying to God, I am not going to do what you have commanded me to do. In fact, this kind of follows up on what we talked about in our last study. We talked about the fact that there were good kings and bad kings in Israel and in Judah. And interestingly, all of the bad kings were kings who practiced idolatry. Kings who did not follow the pattern God had given for worship. The good kings were the ones who walked in the way of David. And David always worshiped God according to the pattern. He always strove to worship God and only God. And so men like Josiah and Hezekiah would come along. There were only 8 good kings of all the kings that reigned over either Israel or Judah, and they tried to restore worship. And so the criteria for a good king or a bad king was not morality. And don't misunderstand that morality is important. But God didn't say this man's a good man because he was moral or because he made good decisions. Many of these kings made terrible decisions. But he called them good kings because they tried to restore true worship and follow the pattern for true worship that was revealed in the Word of God. Now this shouldn't be surprising because we are made in the image of God. And I believe we are like God in this regard, if I may say so. I taught school for 26 years, taught elementary school for the most part. And you know what? When one of my kids, one of these 5th graders who's 10 or 11 years old, when they would break one of my rules out of immaturity, just being silly, just being a kid, well, there was a consequence. There has to be a consequence for every broken rule. But you know what? I was tolerant, if that's the right word. I was more understanding. I thought, well, they're just immature. They're just kids. But listen now, if a kid stood up, and believe it or not, every now and then one would do this. If a kid stood up and said, listen, Mr. Dickinson, I'm not doing what you told me to do. I don't have to do it. Listen, there's no tolerance there. I couldn't allow that. That is an affront to my authority, and that had to be dealt with swiftly and severely. God's the same way. Now, we're going to be talking about King Saul. Let's compare King Saul to King David. You know, from a human standpoint, we would say David committed worse sins than Saul. David, as we know, committed adultery and committed murder and tried to cover it up. And he suffered for that. There were terrible consequences in his life and in his family. But listen, God forgave him. And God did not reject him from being king. On the other hand, Saul simply disobeyed a positive command. We're going to get to that in chapter 15. God told him to utterly destroy the Amalekites, and he didn't do it. And God said, that's it. He rejected him from being king. So in the eyes of God, and I want to be careful here, and I want you to understand that, I'm not saying God tolerates immorality, but he did understand. He was more willing to forgive, if that's the right way to say, sins of immorality committed through the weakness of the flesh than rebellion. Rebellion cannot be tolerated. It cannot be. It's an affront to God's sovereignty. And so Saul was rejected because again and again he rebelled against the sovereign authority of God. And that's what this lesson is about. I said last time Saul is an enigma. He had some good qualities, and sometimes he would show these good qualities, but he was a stubborn man and rebellious, and he was a narcissist. We hear a lot of that today, a lot of that word used about different people today. And he was all about himself. And of course, this is what caused him to rebel against God. The first rebellion that we see is found in 1 Samuel chapter 13. And this is where this statement is made, by the way. I felt compelled. I want to read just a little bit here in 1 Samuel chapter 13. Now, here's what's going on. The Philistines have invaded the country again. There's constant war going on between the Israelites and the Philistines. And so they've invaded the country, and they have a massive army of about 30,000 people. Now, Saul has an army of about 3,000 men, and his son Jonathan has another 1,000, and they're in two different places. So you can imagine now how they're totally outnumbered. Of course, God is with them, or God would be with them if they would trust him, but the people are afraid. In fact, notice here in verse 6 of 1 Samuel 13. When the men of Israel saw that they were in danger, for the people were distressed, then the people hid in caves, in thickets, in rocks, in holes, and in pits. So listen, people were hiding anywhere they could hide from the Philistines. They were scared. They were distressed. Some of the Hebrews, verse 7, crossed over the Jordan to the land of Gad and Gilead. They just left Israel. They thought, let's get out of here before we're overrun by the Philistines. As for Saul, he was still in Gilgal, which was down by the Jordan River, and all the people followed him trembling. So he had an army, but they were shaking in their boots. And we're going to see that Saul was afraid too. Verse 8 says, then he waited 7 days according to the time set by Samuel. So Samuel had told him, stay right where you are, and in 7 days, I don't know why the delay, but he said, in 7 days I'm coming. And of course Samuel is a priest, and when he gets there, he's going to offer a sacrifice and ask God to bless them. And so he says, Saul, don't do anything until I get there and offer a sacrifice. And if we follow the Lord, he will give us the victory. But the Bible says Saul waited 7 days and he couldn't wait any longer. I will tell you what, the hardest thing in the world to do is wait, isn't it? You sit in the doctor's office and you wait and you wait and you wait. You come up to a railroad track and the arm comes down and you wait and you wait and you wait. I'm reminded over there in Matthew 2 that Herod was determined to kill the baby Jesus, and an angel appeared to Joseph and said, take the child and his mother and go down to Egypt and wait. You stay there until I bring you word. Now the angel gave him 2 commands, get up and go and wait. Which do you think was the hardest command? It wasn't hard to get up and go with Herod breathing down his neck, but I guarantee you it's hard to wait. But he waited and he waited, and finally Herod died, and the angel came and said, all right, it's safe to come back now. So it's hard to wait. And Saul is tired of waiting. So Saul said, verse 9, bring a burnt offering and peace offerings here to me. And he offered the burnt offering. Now, this is an illegal offering. He's not qualified to do this. And even though he's offering this to God, it's illegal. It's a sin. He's worshiped the Lord, but so what? If you worship the Lord illegally, that is, not according to the pattern, it's not acceptable. In fact, it's an abomination. But he went ahead and offered this sacrifice. And it happened as soon as it finished. Of all things, he just finishes offering up the sacrifice, and all of a sudden, here comes Samuel. If he'd waited 5 more minutes, it'd have been all right. But he couldn't wait. And so Samuel gets there, and Saul goes out to greet him, and Samuel said in verse 11, what have you done? Saul said, when I saw that the people were scattered from me, and that you did not come within the days appointed, and that the Philistines gathered together at Michmash, then I said, the Philistines will now come down on me at Gilgal, and I've not made supplication to the Lord. Therefore I felt compelled and offered a burnt offering. And Samuel said to Saul, you have done foolishly. You have not kept the commandment of the Lord your God, which he commanded you. For now the Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel forever. But now your kingdom shall not continue. The Lord has sought for himself a man after his own heart, and the Lord has commanded him to be commander over his people, because you have not kept what the Lord commanded you. So he just tells him, you've rebelled. You didn't keep the Lord's commandment, and God has rejected you. Now that seems pretty harsh. But listen, the one thing God will not tolerate and cannot tolerate is rebellion. Is simply saying, I am not going to do what you commanded me to do. Now I'm calling this study, in the words of Saul, I felt compelled. The English Standard Version renders this, I forced myself. And really that's what he was saying. I didn't want to do it. I knew it was not the right thing to do, but the people were leaving me and you didn't come and so on and so forth. And so I had to do it. I just forced myself. I felt compelled to do it. One translation says I felt pressured. I was pressured into this. Now this is simply a rationale for rebellion. Isn't it interesting how people try to rationalize sin? Yes, it was wrong, but because of the circumstances, I felt pressure and I felt compelled that I had to do this. It reminds us of Aaron, doesn't it? When Moses went up on the mountain and was gone all that time, and the people came and said, we don't know what's become of Moses. He may never come back down. Make us a golden calf. And so Aaron did. He took their gold and he made a golden calf, and Moses came down and punished the people, and he came to his brother, and he said, basically what Samuel said, what have you done? And he said, what did these people do to you? Brother, what did they do to you that you made this golden calf? Did they put splinters under your fingernails? What did they do to you? What did he say? He said, you know how the people are. The people were restless. They forced me. He said, they gave me this gold and I put it in the fire and out came this golden calf. I believe it was Matthew Henry who said, what a ridiculous subterfuge. Ridiculous. He put the gold in and the calf just came out. No, he had to work it and form it. But it was a rationale for rebellion. It wasn't me, it was the people, and I felt pressure. I had to do it. And listen, every digression from the truth, every time that people have digressed and have brought into the worship of the church things that are not scriptural, it's the same rationale. We felt we had to do it. We felt pressure. We felt compelled. I want to read you something. I dug this out of some notes that I had. I'd sort of forgotten I had this. I had a meeting I held in Lubbock, Texas, many, many years ago, and a brother out there brought a newspaper article. Now, we didn't have a copy machine at that time. I wish I'd have made a photocopy, but I copied it by hand. And so I've got it handwritten right here. I've still got it after all these years. And it's really interesting. It's an article from the Lubbock Avalanche Journal, dated October the 1st, 1970. And it's kind of a retrospective on the history of churches of Christ in West Texas. And there's a man who, they called him here Pioneer Liff Sanders, and he writes this article, and he says that the East Lubbock Broadway Church of Christ in Lubbock, Texas, built the first meeting house among churches of Christ in West Texas 50 years ago. So if this article is dated in 1970, that would be 1920. And he says, this Church of Christ was the first to have individual communion cups on the plains, about 1920. As we know, G.C. Brewer, in his book 40 Years on the Firing Line, makes the boast, I assume it's a boast, that he was the first preacher in the churches of Christ to advocate individual communion cups, and the first Church of Christ to use them was the church that he was preaching for in Chattanooga, Tennessee in 1915. And people called him digressive and took him to task, but then some other brethren joined him, and eventually most of the churches, he said, accepted it. Not all churches of Christ, even to this day. So in 1920, as I read this, the first Church of Christ on the plains in Texas started using individual cups. But then he goes on to say this, and this is interesting to me. He says this church also started the first Bible classes on Sunday morning about 1908. So in 1908, they started the first Bible classes of any Church of Christ, he says, in West Texas. Now listen to this. He says, in making these changes to Bible classes and individual cups, we had to proceed with great care. For many brethren did not distinguish between custom and faith. They thought the way everything had been practiced in these were itemized in the Scriptures. For we had preached all the while that the Scriptures thoroughly furnished every good work. That therefore all the details were given in the Scriptures as how the work which we were doing was to be done. So he said, now we had to be really careful, because a lot of brethren thought, wait a minute, you're putting in classes, putting in cups. We've never used these before, and the Scriptures doesn't mention this. We're trying to follow the Scriptures. He said, that's what we preached. But he said, we decided to make these changes, and we had to be very careful, of course, with these brethren doing that. He said, after the division over the organ and missionary societies in the late 1880s and early 1890s, the churches of Texas rejected the organized Sunday school, which was run separate from the church. So, you know, there was a division among disciples of Christ in the 1880s and 1890s over instrumental music. And so when Sunday school came along, the churches of Christ rejected Sunday school. At first, it was run separate from the church. They had a superintendent and all that. And so all churches of Christ rejected Sunday school, which originated in the denominations. But eventually, churches of Christ began to accept it too. He says such a Sunday school elected superintendents each quarter with other officers, and it usually was this way in which the organ was voted into use in the church. And so that's the reason we were opposed to them. Eventually, though, most of the congregations gave up their meeting houses to the digressives over instrumental music he's talking about. In fact, they took most of the buildings, and brethren moved out. Hence, we were all against the old-time Sunday school and the way it was run. But, and here's the proverbial but, he says, we saw that if something was not done, we were going to lose our children to the other churches. In other words, he said, we were opposed to Sunday school. It was through the old Sunday school system that instrumental music was voted into churches of Christ, and there was the division. So we were opposed to it and the way it operated. But we saw these other churches having Sunday school, and we thought if we don't have something like that, we're going to lose our children. And so something had to be done. At least that was their decision. Therefore, we started to arrange Bible classes. They didn't call it Sunday school anymore. They said, we'll just change the name to Bible classes. And they put it under the supervision of the elders. So instead of being separate, they just made the elders the superintendent over the Bible classes. And it became a work of the church. We had some opposition, but we let them understand that we were not trying to force anything on them. Oh, no. We managed in such a way that we prevented division in their church, which many churches had. In this way, we also managed to keep peace in the Lubbock church, while other churches had strife and controversy and even division. You know what you could boil that article down to? We felt compelled. We were under pressure. We saw all these denominational churches with their organizations or Sunday schools and so forth, and I guess some of their young people maybe were being drawn to that, and they thought, we've got to do something. And so we forced ourselves. We felt pressure. We felt compelled. And they left the pattern, the original pattern. And it caused division and controversy, which exists even to this day, and it's going to exist as long as people do not follow the pattern. So listen, here's a great lesson. It started way back in the days of Saul, even before that. God will not tolerate rebellion. He will not tolerate those who turn away from His commandments, no matter what the pressure is. We must maintain our allegiance to God's Word. Well, Samuel tells him, you've been rejected. Your house will no longer be the house of the kingdom. God has sought out a man after His own heart, and he will be the one who will be the new king in Israel after your death. And he turned away from Saul. Well, they still had this problem of the Philistines. And the Philistines were up on a plateau called Michmash. And Jonathan was over there. We're introduced to Jonathan here. And Jonathan was a great warrior. And Jonathan turned to his armor bearer and said, I think if we attack Michmash, there were two rocks, the perpendicular rocks you had to climb over. And so the Philistines didn't have any guards there. Nobody would climb over those two rocks. He said, I think we can climb over those two perpendicular rocks and attack and catch them by surprise. The armor bearer said, I'm with you. Jonathan said, the Lord can save by many or by few. And so they, on their hands and knees, they climbed over these two perpendicular rocks, and they surprised the garrison and killed a bunch of Philistines, and the Philistines fled in panic. And anyway, the Israelites won a great, great victory on that occasion. Now again, in chapter 15, we have to deal with that before we're through today. Samuel comes to Saul and says, listen, I want you to go and utterly destroy the Amalekites. The Amalekites had attacked the Israelites when they were coming through the wilderness, attacked the rear, the old people and the stragglers. And God said, I'm going to remember that. Go and utterly destroy them. Well, Saul went, but he didn't do it. He spared the best of the flocks, and he spared the king. And so Samuel comes to greet him, and he says, I have obeyed the voice of the Lord. And Samuel said, then what's this bleating of the sheep? What is this noise that I hear? Well, he says, the people spared the best of the flocks to sacrifice to God, and they spared the king, but I have obeyed the voice of the Lord. Same old story. And Samuel tells him, you've been rejected, and God has turned his back on you because you have not obeyed him. And then we have this classic passage we must read in 1 Samuel chapter 15, where Samuel tells Saul, has the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed than the fat of rams. For rebellion is as the sin of witchcraft, and stubbornness is as iniquity and idolatry. Because you've rejected the word of the Lord, he also has rejected you from being king. So this is the rejection of Saul, because he rebelled and disobeyed the word of the Lord. And this is going to give rise, of course, to David. David is the man after God's own heart. And David is going to be anointed to be the next king after the death of Saul. In 1 John 5 and verse 3, John said, this is the love of God, that we keep his commandments. And his commandments are not grievous. The word grievous there means burdensome, or disagreeable, or oppressive. They don't weigh us down. Now, sometimes God's commandments are difficult and hard, but because we love him, we're not burdened down and oppressed. We obey God no matter what he asks us to do. Obedience is informed, obedience is immediate, and obedience is impassioned. And this is exactly what Saul lacked. And so he was rejected as king. Let's learn the lesson today. Let us love God and obey his commandments. And if we do that, God will bless us. If we don't, we'll be rejected as King Saul was so long, long ago. In the next study, we're going to be introduced to David. And we're going to talk about this man after God's own heart that God has chosen to take the place of Saul. I look forward to that, and I hope you'll be with us. And so we thank you for being with us today. Thank you so much.